4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
Hey guys, welcome to MB Tech Talker. My name's Matt. In this video I'm going to show you how to configure the Palo Alto Networks App-ID feature on a VM series next generation firewall using VMware Workstation. If you haven't watched my previous next generation firewall videos, please do this now so you're ready to follow along with this tutorial. As more applications become more evasive, it's important administrators have the ability to control which applications are allowed in and out of their network. App-ID provides this visibility and control of applications even when they're masquerading as legitimate traffic, hopping ports or creeping through the firewall using encryption. When administrators work with App-ID, they have the ability to learn the characteristics of thousands of applications and their associated risks. Administrators can then categorize applications and configure security policies based on categories and not just individual applications. You can view details of an application by accessing the Applipedia page by clicking on the Object tab and selecting applications on the left hand side and then performing a search on the application in question. Details include the description of what the application performs, which ports used including standard and secure ports, the application dependency, which apps the application implicitly uses, what the deny action is. Further down you can see all the characteristics including whether the application is evasive, if it uses excessive bandwidth, and any known vulnerabilities. And at the bottom of the window it provides a risk rating. In this instance it's 5, which is a high risk. App-ID gives administrators full visibility and gives the benefit of automatically classifying traffic all the time, which is due to the thousands of applications held within Palo Alto Networks application database. The Application Command Center, or ACC, shows application usage like web browsing or Facebook, and even shows apps by user, giving you details of apps that they have been using historically. Let's go through a simple scenario. Here we have a PC using an FTP client to access an FTP server that resides on the internet. When the FTP traffic turns up at the firewall, App-ID checks the security policy and can see that the FTP application is allowed using the application default port, which is specified in Applipedia. App-ID checks the application bit pattern to verify that the traffic is legitimate FTP traffic and allows the connection to the FTP server. On another occasion, the same user wants to download a piece of software from a peer-to-peer site. He knows that FTP is allowed through the firewall, so he configures his BitTorrent application to use TCP port 21 and attempts to download the software. Will this work? No, because the firewall will see that the BitTorrent application bit pattern does not match the unique FTP bit pattern and blocks the traffic. This security policy specifically allows FTP access from the user zone to the untrust zone without the need of specifying ports. This is a huge difference between a next generation firewall and a port-based legacy firewall. Okay, so let's go through the lab prerequisites. First of all, we need to make sure that we've got a Ubuntu virtual machine installed within Workstation. It needs to have an IP address, default gateway and DNS configured. We also need to make sure VMnet 4 has been assigned to the Ubuntu VM. Then on the Palo Alto Networks firewall, we need to make sure that the DMZ security zone has been created. The DMZ interface has an IP address, subnet mask, etc. And we also need to make sure that there's a management profile assigned so the interface can be pinged. And then lastly, the Ubuntu VM needs to be able to successfully ping the DMZ firewall interface. Okay, so let's go through the lab objectives. So first of all, we need to configure a security policy on the next generation firewall to allow the Ubuntu VM access to the internet for updates and to download software packages. Then we need to configure a security policy on the next generation firewall to allow the client FTP access to the Ubuntu VM using application default. Install and configure an FTP server on the Ubuntu virtual machine. Set up an FTP user account on the Ubuntu virtual machine. Test access from the Windows 10 client to the FTP server and verify firewall traffic logs. Change the standard FTP ports to non-standard ports on the Ubuntu FTP server. and then finally retest from the Windows 10 client to the FTP server and verify firewall traffic logs again. Okay, so moving on to the lab, let's just check that the lab prerequisites have been met. So first of all, I need to confirm that the Ubuntu server is turned on and booted up and you have access to the desktop. Need to verify that the interface has been assigned to VMnet 4. So as you can see here, it's assigned to the VMnet 4, which is the DMZ interface of the firewall. So that's correct. And then we need to verify the IP details of the VM. So we need to go into settings and we need to go to the wired connection and click on the cog here. You can see it's connected. I've got an IP address of 172.16.4.100, a default route of 172.16.4.254, and the DNS is set to Google's DNS server of 8.8.8.8. So that looks good, so we can close that. Let's open up a command prompt and go to terminal. Let's ping the interface of the firewall, so ping 172.16.4.254. That looks good. So at this stage we are pretty good, and all we need to just verify now is that the DMZ interface has been configured on the firewall. So over at the firewall, we're going to go onto the network tab and into zones, and as you can see, the DMZ interface has been assigned to Ethernet 1/3. Okay, so let's start going through the lab objectives. So the first one is to create a security policy on the next generation firewall to allow the Ubuntu VM access to the internet for software updates or downloading packages, etc. So let's go over to the firewall and then click on the policies tab, and we're going to go to the existing internet traffic rule. Click on that, and then we're going to hit the source tab, and we're simply just going to add the DMZ zone into that and click OK. Commit that change, and then we can go back to the Ubuntu VM just to confirm internet access. We can do a software update. Close that, back to the VM, open up a browser. Let's just click on, let's go to Facebook. So we've got internet access, no problems there. Let's open up a terminal and let's do a sudo apt get update. So you can see we're able to access the Ubuntu update servers, and let's also earlier I had to use the GUI to verify the IP interface details, because if I did an ifconfig, you can see that NetTools isn't installed, so I'm going to install that now. So sudo apt install NetTools, and that's going to download that. Should take a few seconds, and then all well and good, we'll be able to issue the ifconfig command, and now you can see we've got, or can see, the IP configuration. So that's the first objective done, and we'll move on to the next. Right, let's go through the next objective. So we're going to configure a new security policy on the next generation firewall to allow client FTP access to the Ubuntu VM using application default. So on the policies tab, we're going to click on add, and we're going to give the rule a name. So let's just call it FTP access. Go to the source, and the source zone is going to be the user zone. That's where the Windows 10 client resides. And then destination, we're going to click on the DMZ zone, and that's where the Ubuntu VM resides. Now the application, we need to choose FTP. So if we just type in FTP and then click on it, and then on the services tab, it needs to be set to application default. Action is to allow, and then the default settings here to log session at the end to make sure that it logs any traffic that matches this rule, and then click OK. So by specifying FTP as the application, we are enforcing App-ID and in turn matching the bit pattern of the application. So the main purpose of this security rule is to make sure that only legitimate FTP traffic is allowed through to the Ubuntu VM and not just any application using port 21. So for instance, if we were to configure the rule without the FTP application, we replaced it with any, like this rule here, then in essence this would be the same as a port-based firewall, which just wouldn't be secure enough. If you wanted to confirm the default port number of a given application, you can go to the Applipedia, which can be viewed on the firewall by going to Objects and Applications. You can see over 2,500 applications are held on the Palo Alto's networks database. So let's just check out FTP. So type in FTP and hit enter, and then look for it in the list and then just double click on it. As you can see, the standard FTP port in Applipedia is TCP port 21. So this is what is referred to as application default in the security rule. Okay, so let's move on to the next objective. We need to install the FTP server on the Ubuntu VM. To make things a little bit easier, I've copied the commands into a text editor from a tutorial that was put together by linuxconfig.org. The URL is on the screen now, and I'll also put it in the description below. So first of all, let's open up a terminal and install the FTP server. Enter password, let that install, and then we'll copy the next line. This is to make a backup config file just in case anything goes wrong. Paste that in. Now we're going to create a new config file. And then we're going to add all these lines of commands in to the new config file, and then we're going to do Control and X and then Y to save it, and then hit enter. And then we need to allow the ports through the Ubuntu firewall. I've also added in 2020 and 2121 for the next part of the lab, so I'm just going to copy that and pop them in. Hit return, and then we're going to restart the FTP server, and then next we need to create an FTP user. So sudo user add, and then we need to create a password for the user as well. So okay, so that's done. So now we can move over to the Windows 10 client to test the FTP access. Okay, so we're back over at the Windows 10 client. So first of all, we need to open up a command prompt, and then we can attempt an FTP connection to 172.16.4.100, which is the Ubuntu server. That looks good. So we've got a connection. So let's just test that we can log in. So FTP user and the password. That's good. So that looks great. And then let's just quit out of here to terminate the session. And now we can go over to the firewall and then click on the monitor tab. And then let's take a look at the logs for the Ubuntu server. So I'm going to click on 172.16.4.100 as the destination, so that it just gives us all of the traffic to the Ubuntu server. And you can see that the Palo Alto Next Generation Firewall has identified the application as FTP and has allowed the traffic through the firewall on port 21. So that looks good. So now we can move on to the next part. Okay, so I'm back over at the Ubuntu VM. We're going to take the testing a little further. We're going to change the FTP server's listening and data ports to something that is non-standard. So I've got a terminal open. I need to go and edit the FTP config file again. So you should have that in your command history. And then at the bottom, we're going to add 2 lines. So the first one is going to be the listen port. So that's listen_port equals 2020. And then we've got FTP_data port equals 2121. And then Control and X, Y for yes, and then return to save the config. And then we need to restart the FTP server and then hit return. So now we can go over to the Windows 10 virtual machine and do the testing again. Okay, so we're back on the Windows 10 VM. Let's open up a command prompt and let's try and make a connection to the FTP server again. But this time we're going to just type in FTP, hit return, and then we're going to use the open command and go to 172.16.4.100, and then we're going to specify the port 2020, which is the listening port of the FTP server, and we're going to hit return. Now this is going to be denied because the FTP server is not using the application default specified in Applipedia. So we're going to wait for this connection to time out, and then we're going to go back to the firewall and we're going to take a look at the firewall logs. That's good timing. So we can go over to the firewall now, and then we're going to do a refresh. And as you can see, we've got traffic coming from the Windows 10 client to the FTP server, and it's trying to make a connection on 2020. The application hasn't been identified because there's not enough traffic's passed through to actually identify the application because it's been denied. And if you remember, if we go back to policies and take a look at the FTP access rule, we have specified the application to be FTP, so the bit pattern must match the FTP application, and we've also specified the service as application default. Now if you remember, application default is the port number that is specified in Applipedia. So if you go to objects and back to applications, and then we typed in FTP, we did this earlier in the lab, and then we clicked on FTP. Just a reminder that the default port was actually TCP port 21. So we're going to have to make some changes. Now I've come across scenarios where application listening ports have been changed to non-standard ports like we've done here. So we need to know how we can configure the next generation firewall to use these custom ports. So what we need to do is go to the object tab and then select services here on the left hand side, and you can see there are 2 services configured by default, which is service HTTP, which is using destination port 80 and 8080, and then service HTTPS, which is destination port 443. We're going to create our own new service by clicking on add, and then we're going to name it FTP 2020. It's TCP and the port is 2020, and then we're going to click OK. And now we can go back to the policy tab, and then we can edit the FTP access rule, and we're going to go to the service tab, and instead of this being application default, we're going to change that, and we're going to specify our own custom FTP port, which is FTP 2020. Click OK, and then we're going to commit that change. Once that's committed successfully, then we can go back to the Windows 10 client and then retest the FTP connection back to the Ubuntu server. Okay, back at the Windows 10 VM, let's open up a command prompt, FTP, and then open 172.16.4.100, and then we're going to specify the 2020 port, and that looks good. So we've got a connection, so let's log in with the user, FTP user, password. Okay, so logged in, that's all working. So back at the firewall logs, as you can see, the traffic has been permitted on port 2020 from the Windows 10 client to the Ubuntu FTP server. App-ID has identified the traffic as legitimate FTP traffic and allowed the traffic through using the FTP access rule. So in summary, we created an FTP access security policy to only permit FTP application on its default port. Now originally under the services tab we had application default specified, which was port 21. But in real world scenarios where application owners or server admins need to change the application listening port to non-standard ports, we need to be able to adapt and be able to create custom service like we did here. So we created the FTP 2020. But we still are enforcing App-ID so that non-FTP traffic can't tunnel through using the FTP port number. Well, that's the end of the lab. I hope you liked the video and found it interesting, and I'll see you on the next video. Okay guys, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Over the next coming weeks, I will be uploading more videos where I will be sharing more content about Palo Alto firewall features and technologies and how to configure them. If you like this video, I'm sure you know what to do by now, but just in case you don't, please hit that like button below and share with your friends, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell to get notified every single time I post a new video. If you have any ideas of video content you want me to create, please put them in the comments below, as I would love to hear your feedback on any aspect of my channel. Please keep watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.